The frozen steppes of Eastern Europe, 1943. The Soviet Red Army is bleeding. Every mile gained costs thousands of lives. German panzers roll forward with mechanical precision. Soviet T-34s burn on the battlefield like funeral pyres. Stalin's generals are desperate. But across the Atlantic Ocean, in the sprawling factories of Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Los Angeles, something extraordinary is happening. American workers, machinists, welders, women who'd never held a rivet gun before, are building the machines that will turn the tide of the Eastern Front. This is the story you've never heard. The story of how American ingenuity, American industry, and American determination became the hidden allies that helped crush the Nazi war machine. If you believe in the courage and brilliance that defines America's greatest generation, hit that subscribe button now, because this untold story of how American innovation changed the course of World War II is just getting started. Most people think the Soviet victory over Nazi Germany was won with Soviet blood and Soviet steel alone. That's what Stalin wanted the world to believe. That's what Soviet propaganda screamed from every poster and newspaper. But the truth is far more complex, far more remarkable, and it places American contribution at the very heart of one of history's most decisive campaigns. This is the story of Lend-Lease, a program so massive, so audacious, so uniquely American in its scope and execution that it literally kept the Soviet Union from collapse. And yet, for decades, it remained hidden in the shadows of history. Picture this. It's June 1941. Operation Barbarossa has just begun. 3 million German soldiers crash across the Soviet border in the largest military invasion in human history. The Wehrmacht is unstoppable. Soviet forces are in full retreat. Entire armies are encircled and destroyed. By December 1941, German forces are at the gates of Moscow. Leningrad is besieged. The industrial heartland of Ukraine is in Nazi hands. Soviet tank production has fallen by over 60%. Aircraft factories are being hastily dismantled and moved east beyond the Ural Mountains to escape German bombers. The Soviet Union is bleeding out. And that's when America stepped in. Now here's where the story gets interesting. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt understood something that many politicians of his era didn't. He understood that America's security depended on keeping Britain and the Soviet Union in the fight. If Hitler conquered the Soviet Union, if he seized the oil fields of the Caucasus, the wheat fields of Ukraine, the industrial might of Soviet Russia, then Nazi Germany would become unstoppable. The Atlantic Ocean would become a very small barrier indeed. So Roosevelt made a decision that would change the course of world history. He extended Lend-Lease to the Soviet Union. Lend-Lease. The name sounds bureaucratic, almost boring. But this program was anything but boring. It was one of the most ambitious logistics operations ever conceived. Think about what it meant. America would manufacture weapons, vehicles, aircraft, food, raw materials, literally everything an army needs to fight, and then ship it thousands of miles across submarine-infested oceans to a nation that, just a few years earlier, had been ideologically opposed to everything America stood for. It was audacious. It was brilliant. It was quintessentially American. Let me paint you a picture of what this actually meant on the ground. Imagine you're a Soviet tank commander in the winter of 1942. Your T-34 has been in constant combat for months. The engine is worn, the tracks are damaged. You're low on fuel. Your crew hasn't had a proper meal in days. Then, one frozen morning, a convoy arrives at your position. American Studebaker trucks, sturdy, reliable, painted in Soviet green but still bearing the marks of their Detroit origin. They're loaded with supplies, high-octane aviation fuel, spare tank tracks, crates of American Spam and powdered eggs. Your mechanic opens another crate and finds American ball bearings, precision-machined parts that will keep your T-34 running. Another truck carries radio equipment, American-made transceivers that actually work, unlike the temperamental Soviet models. You realize something profound. You're not fighting alone. Pause for effect. The scale of American aid to the Soviet Union was staggering. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States shipped over 400,000 trucks and jeeps to the Soviet Union. 400,000! That's more vehicles than the entire German Wehrmacht had at the start of Barbarossa. These weren't just any trucks. They were Studebakers, Dodges, Willys Jeeps, vehicles that could handle the brutal Russian terrain, the frozen tundra, the spring mud that turned roads into rivers of slime. Soviet generals quickly realized that these American trucks were superior to anything Soviet industry could produce. They were reliable, they didn't break down, and they gave the Red Army something it had never had before: mobility. But it wasn't just trucks. American factories shipped 14,000 aircraft to the Soviet Union. 14! P-39 Airacobras, P-63 King Cobras, A-20 Havoc bombers. Soviet pilots loved the Airacobra. It was fast, maneuverable, and packed a devastating 37mm cannon in the nose. Soviet ace Alexander Pokrishkin shot down dozens of German aircraft flying an American-made Airacobra. When asked about his aircraft, he said simply, "It was a weapon that gave us confidence." Pause for effect. The scale of American aid to the Soviet Union was staggering. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States shipped over 400,000 trucks and jeeps to the Soviet Union. 400,000! That's more vehicles than the entire German Wehrmacht had at the start of Barbarossa. These weren't just any trucks. They were Studebakers, Dodges, Willys Jeeps, vehicles that could handle the brutal Russian terrain, the frozen tundra, the spring mud that turned roads into rivers of slime. Soviet generals quickly realized that these American trucks were superior to anything Soviet industry could produce. They were reliable, they didn't break down, and they gave the Red Army something it had never had before: mobility. But it wasn't just trucks. American factories shipped 14,000 aircraft to the Soviet Union. 14! P-39 Airacobras, P-63 King Cobras, A-20 Havoc bombers. Soviet pilots loved the Airacobra. It was fast, maneuverable, and packed a devastating 37mm cannon in the nose. Soviet ace Alexander Pokrishkin shot down dozens of German aircraft flying an American-made Airacobra. When asked about his aircraft, he said simply, "It was a weapon that gave us confidence." The United States shipped over 13,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. M4 Sherman tanks, M3 Lee tanks, tank destroyers. These vehicles filled critical gaps in Soviet armored forces during the darkest days of the war. When Soviet tank factories were still being relocated east, when production was at its lowest, American armor kept Soviet tank divisions in the fight. But here's what most people don't understand. The real genius of Lend-Lease wasn't just the weapons, it was everything else. The mundane stuff that doesn't make it into war movies, but absolutely wins wars. American factories shipped over 15 million pairs of army boots to the Soviet Union. 15 million! Think about that. A soldier can't fight if his feet are frozen. He can't march if his boots are falling apart. Those American boots kept Soviet soldiers moving through the brutal Russian winter. American factories shipped hundreds of thousands of tons of steel, aluminum, copper, raw materials that Soviet industry desperately needed. Over 300,000 tons of explosives. Enough to keep Soviet artillery batteries firing. Enough to build millions of shells and bombs. And food. Oh, the food! This is where American agricultural might truly showed its strength. The United States shipped over 4 million tons of food to the Soviet Union. Spam, powdered eggs, flour, sugar, canned meat, dried milk. Soviet soldiers joked grimly that they were winning the war on American spam. But it wasn't a joke. Soviet agriculture had been devastated by the German invasion. The fertile lands of Ukraine were under Nazi occupation. Soviet civilians were starving. American food kept the Red Army fed. It kept Soviet workers in the factories alive and working. It prevented mass starvation that would have crippled the Soviet war effort. Let me tell you about the routes this aid took, because this is where American bravery truly shines. There were three main routes for Lend-Lease aid to reach the Soviet Union: the Persian Corridor, the Pacific Route, and the Arctic convoys. Each one was a story of incredible courage and determination. The Arctic convoys, that's where American and British merchant seamen proved they were every bit as brave as any combat soldier. Picture the Arctic Ocean in winter, waves 40 feet high, temperatures so cold that seawater freezes on deck, coating everything in ice. German U-boats prowling beneath the surface, German bombers flying from occupied Norway. And through this hell, convoys of merchant ships, many of them American, sailing to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk to deliver their cargo. These weren't warships crewed by trained naval personnel. These were merchant vessels, liberty ships, built in American shipyards, crewed by American merchant mariners. Ordinary men doing an extraordinary job. The statistics are chilling. Over 3,000 Allied seamen died on the Arctic convoys. Ships were torpedoed, bombed, crushed by ice. One of the worst disasters was convoy PQ-17 in July 1942. 35 merchant ships set out. 24 were sunk. American ships like the SS Carleton, SS Washington, SS Hoosier, destroyed by German U-boats and aircraft. But the surviving ships got through, and their cargo, tanks, aircraft, ammunition, reached Soviet hands. The men who sailed these convoys knew the odds. They knew that every voyage might be their last. But they kept sailing, because they understood what was at stake. They understood that every tank they delivered, every crate of ammunition, every barrel of fuel meant Soviet soldiers could keep fighting, meant the Nazi advance could be stopped. These American merchant mariners were heroes in the truest sense of the word. Now let's talk about the Persian Corridor, because this route showcased American engineering and logistics genius. When the Arctic route became too dangerous, when too many ships were being sunk, American planners developed an alternative. They would ship supplies to Iran, then truck them north into the Soviet Union. The problem? Iran's infrastructure was primitive. The roads were dirt tracks that turned to mud in spring. The ports couldn't handle large cargo ships. The railroad from the Persian Gulf to the Caspian Sea was ancient and inefficient. So what did America do? American engineers descended on Iran and rebuilt the entire supply corridor. They upgraded ports, they improved railroads, they built new roads. They established truck assembly plants where American-made vehicles could be assembled and driven north. U.S. Army engineers and Persian Gulf Command personnel worked around the clock in temperatures exceeding 120 degrees Fahrenheit. These weren't combat troops. These were engineers, mechanics, logistics specialists. But they were fighting the war just as surely as any infantry soldier. By 1943, the Persian Corridor was delivering over 200,000 tons of supplies per month to the Soviet Union. American trucks, driven by American soldiers and Iranian drivers, made the long journey north, climbing mountain passes, navigating treacherous roads. Many never made it. Accidents, breakdowns, harsh conditions claimed lives. But the supplies kept flowing. Here's something most history books don't tell you. The Soviet Union would have struggled to survive without American raw materials. Soviet tank factories needed aluminum for aircraft. American aluminum shipments filled that need. Soviet munitions factories needed copper for shell casings. American copper filled that need. Soviet railroads, stretched to breaking point, needed locomotives and rolling stock. America shipped over 2,000 locomotives and 11,000 rail cars. These trains moved Soviet armies to the front. They evacuated civilians from besieged cities. The Soviet war economy functioning. Let me give you a specific example that shows just how crucial American aid was. It's the spring of 1943. The Battle of Kursk is approaching. Hitler has ordered Operation Citadel, a massive offensive designed to encircle and destroy Soviet forces in the Kursk salient. If the Germans succeed, they'll regain the initiative on the Eastern Front. Soviet intelligence knows the attack is coming. Soviet generals are preparing the largest defensive network in military history. Minefields, anti-tank ditches, artillery positions stretching for miles. But they need supplies. They need mines, barbed wire, explosives, ammunition. They need fuel for tanks and aircraft. They need mobility to move reserves quickly. American Lend-Lease provides much of what they need. American trucks move Soviet artillery into position. American explosives fill Soviet mines. American fuel powers Soviet tanks and aircraft. When the battle begins in July 1943, Soviet forces are ready. The Germans attack with hundreds of tanks, including the fearsome new Tiger and Panther models. But Soviet defenses hold. Soviet artillery, supplied with American-made communications equipment, coordinates devastating counter-battery fire. Soviet tank reserves, transported by American trucks, rush to plug gaps in the line. After 2 weeks of brutal fighting, the German offensive collapses. It's the last major German offensive on the Eastern Front. From this point forward, the Red Army will advance, and it won't stop until it reaches Berlin. Could the Soviets have won Kursk without American aid? Maybe. Soviet courage and Soviet blood won that battle, but American supplies made that victory possible. American logistics gave Soviet commanders the flexibility they needed. American material freed up Soviet industry to focus on building tanks and aircraft instead of trucks and locomotives. Here's the part of the story that Stalin never wanted anyone to know. After the war, Soviet propaganda minimized the role of American aid. Stalin wanted the world to believe that the Soviet Union had defeated Nazi Germany alone, through Soviet strength and Soviet sacrifice. Soviet historians were ordered to downplay Lend-Lease. Soviet textbooks barely mentioned it. For decades, Soviet citizens grew up believing that their victory was entirely their own. But the Soviet leaders who fought the war knew differently. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the greatest Soviet commander of World War II, the man who defended Moscow, who liberated Leningrad, who captured Berlin, said this after the war, and I want you to listen carefully. "We didn't have explosives or gunpowder. We didn't have anything to charge our rifle cartridges with. The Americans really saved us with their gunpowder and explosives. And how much sheet steel they gave us. How could we have produced our tanks without American steel?" Think about that. The greatest Soviet general of the war, the man who had every reason to claim Soviet self-sufficiency, admitted that American aid was essential. Nikita Khrushchev, who later became Soviet premier, said, "If the United States had not helped us, we would not have won the war. One-on-one against Hitler's Germany, we would not have withstood its onslaught." These weren't American propaganda statements. These were admissions from Soviet leaders themselves, spoken after the war when there was no immediate need to flatter the United States. They were speaking truth. Let me tell you about some of the unsung American heroes who made this possible. There was W. Averell Harriman, American ambassador to the Soviet Union from 1943 to 1946. Harriman negotiated tirelessly with Soviet officials to ensure Lend-Lease supplies got to where they were needed. He dealt with Soviet bureaucracy, Soviet suspicion, Soviet secrecy. It was often frustrating, often thankless, but Harriman understood the strategic importance of keeping the Soviet Union in the fight. He was fighting the war with diplomacy and logistics instead of bullets. There were the American pilots of the Alaska-Siberia ferry route. American pilots flew bombers and fighters from factories in the United States to Alaska, where Soviet pilots would take over and fly them across Siberia to the front. Over 8,000 aircraft were delivered this way. American pilots faced brutal Arctic weather, mechanical failures, navigation challenges. Some didn't make it. Their sacrifice was part of the hidden war effort that made victory possible. There were the workers in American factories. Rosie the Riveter wasn't just building aircraft for American forces, she was building aircraft for Soviet pilots. The welder in Pittsburgh wasn't just making steel for American ships, he was making steel that would be shipped to Soviet tank factories. The farmer in Iowa wasn't just feeding American soldiers, he was feeding Soviet soldiers and Soviet workers. Every American who contributed to the war effort was, in a sense, an ally of the Red Army. Now let's talk about the impact of all this on the battlefield. By 1944, the Red Army was a different force than it had been in 1941. It was mobile, well-supplied, technologically sophisticated. Soviet tank armies could execute massive encirclement operations, cutting off entire German army groups. How? Because they had the trucks to move infantry and supplies rapidly. They had the radios to coordinate complex operations. They had the fuel to keep tanks advancing. Much of this mobility came from American aid. Soviet pilots flying American aircraft dominated German fighters over the Eastern Front. Soviet logistics ran on American trucks and locomotives. Soviet soldiers wore American boots, ate American food, fought with ammunition made from American raw materials. The Red Army that stormed into Eastern Europe and Germany in 1944 and 1945 was in many ways an army built on American industrial might combined with Soviet courage and determination. Here's a specific story that captures this perfectly. It's January 1945. The Vistula-Oder Offensive. Soviet forces are preparing to smash through German defenses in Poland and drive to within striking distance of Berlin. Marshal Zhukov commands over 2 million Soviet soldiers. They're facing desperate German forces defending the approaches to the Reich itself. Zhukov needs mobility. He needs to break through German lines and then advance so quickly that the Germans can't form new defensive positions. His plan relies heavily on American trucks. Soviet tank armies will lead the breakthrough, but follow-on infantry and artillery need to keep pace. American Studebakers carry Soviet infantry. American jeeps carry Soviet officers coordinating the advance. American trucks haul ammunition, fuel, food. The offensive begins on January 12th. Within days, German defenses collapse. Soviet forces advance over 300 miles in 3 weeks, reaching the Oder River just 40 miles from Berlin. It's one of the most successful offensive operations of the entire war. And it's made possible, in part, by American logistic support. German generals writing after the war were stunned by Soviet mobility. They couldn't understand how Soviet forces could advance so quickly, how they could sustain such deep offensive operations. The answer was American trucks, American fuel, American supplies, freeing up Soviet industry and Soviet logistics to focus on combat operations. Let me share something that brings this full circle. There's a statue in Fairbanks, Alaska, commemorating the Alaska-Siberia ferry route. It's a reminder of the thousands of aircraft that passed through there, flown by American and Soviet pilots working together. There are memorials at Russian ports like Murmansk, honoring the Allied sailors who died delivering supplies. For years after the war, elderly Soviet veterans would privately acknowledge the role American aid played in their survival and victory. They remembered the spam, the trucks, the boots. They knew. But here's what makes this story so powerful, so uniquely American. The United States was fighting a two-front war. American forces were battling across the Pacific, island hopping toward Japan. American forces were fighting in North Africa, Italy, preparing for the invasion of France. American industry was equipping American forces, British forces, Chinese forces, resistance movements across occupied Europe. And on top of all that, American industry was supplying the Soviet Union with enough material to keep 300 Soviet divisions in the field. No other nation in history had ever attempted such a feat. No other nation could have succeeded. This was American industrial might unleashed. This was American innovation, American work ethic, American determination to win, not just for America, but for the cause of defeating fascism everywhere. The assembly line techniques pioneered by Henry Ford were now building Liberty ships in weeks instead of months. American factories operated 24 hours a day. American workers achieved production miracles that German and Japanese planners thought impossible. And it wasn't just about beating Hitler. American leaders understood that defeating Nazi Germany was only one step. They were already thinking about the post-war world, about preventing future conflicts, about building a world order based on democracy and freedom. Lend-Lease was part of that vision. It was strategic, yes, but it was also idealistic in the best American tradition. Let me tell you what happened after the war. Stalin immediately began downplaying American contributions. Soviet propaganda erased Lend-Lease from history books. The Cold War began, and for decades, the story of American aid to the Soviet Union was lost in the fog of ideological conflict. Americans who had worked so hard, who had sacrificed so much to help defeat Hitler, watched as their efforts were dismissed and forgotten by the very nation they had helped save. But history has a way of revealing truth. After the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, archives opened. Russian historians gained access to previously classified documents. What they found confirmed what veterans had privately known all along. American aid was crucial. Soviet economic analyses from the war years showed that without Lend-Lease, Soviet industry would have collapsed. Soviet military reports detailed the dependence on American trucks and transportation. The truth emerged from decades of propaganda. Today, honest historians on both sides acknowledge the reality. The defeat of Nazi Germany required Soviet blood, Soviet courage, Soviet sacrifice, absolutely. But it also required American steel, American food, American logistics. It was a combined effort. The Red Army fought with incredible bravery and determination, and they did it sustained by American industrial power. Both things are true. Both contributions mattered. Here's what you need to understand about American character. When Roosevelt extended Lend-Lease to the Soviet Union, many Americans were skeptical. The Soviet Union was a communist dictatorship. Stalin had killed millions of his own people in purges and forced collectivization. Soviet ideology was completely opposed to American values. Why should America help such a regime? But Roosevelt and the American people understood something profound. The enemy of our enemy can be our ally when the stakes are high enough. Defeating Hitler was the priority. Everything else was secondary. This was pragmatic, but it was also generous. America didn't have to help. America could have let Germany and the Soviet Union bleed each other white and then pick up the pieces. But that wasn't the American way. Americans don't stand aside when evil threatens to conquer the world. Americans fight. And if fighting means helping an ally we might not agree with on everything, then that's what we do. The supplies America sent to the Soviet Union, over $11 billion worth by war's end, equivalent to over $150 billion in today's dollars, weren't loans in any meaningful sense. Stalin never paid them back. The Soviet Union collapsed, owing the United States billions. But America didn't send that aid for profit. America sent it to win a war against fascism. That's the difference. That's American generosity on a scale the world had never seen. Fast forward to the end of the war. May 1945. Berlin has fallen. Hitler is dead. Nazi Germany has surrendered. Soviet soldiers plant the red flag over the Reichstag. Photographs show Soviet tanks, Soviet soldiers, Soviet victory. But look closer at those photographs. Many of those Soviet soldiers are wearing American boots. Many of those Soviet tanks are refueled from American fuel cans. Many of those Soviet trucks in the background are Studebakers. The victory is Soviet, but the tools of victory, in significant part, are American. Across Eastern Europe, Soviet forces have liberated concentration camps, freed millions from Nazi tyranny, ended the Holocaust. It's one of history's greatest moral victories, and it was achieved by an alliance, an uneasy alliance, a temporary alliance, but an alliance nonetheless, between American industrial might and Soviet military power. Both sides contributed. Both sides can claim credit for destroying the greatest evil of the 20th century. Let me bring this to a close with a reflection. The story of Lend-Lease, the story of America's hidden alliance with the Soviet Red Army, is a story about the American strategic thinking, American generosity, American determination to defeat tyranny wherever it threatens freedom. It's a story that was hidden for decades by Cold War politics and Soviet propaganda. But it's a story that needs to be told, because it reveals something essential about American character. When the world faced its darkest hour, when Nazi Germany threatened to conquer all of Europe and destroy Western civilization, America responded not just with soldiers and weapons for its own forces, but with a massive aid program that kept allies in the fight. America understood that defeating Hitler required a global effort. America was willing to set aside ideological differences, willing to help even a nation whose values contradicted American ideals, because the alternative, a Nazi-dominated world, was unthinkable. The workers in American factories who built trucks and tanks and aircraft for the Soviet Union were fighting Hitler just as surely as any soldier on the front lines. The merchant mariners who braved Arctic seas to deliver supplies were heroes in the truest sense. The engineers who rebuilt Iranian railroads, the diplomats who negotiated aid agreements, the farmers who grew food, all of them were hidden allies of the Red Army. All of them were warriors in the Great Crusade against fascism. And here's the ultimate irony. Stalin tried to erase this story. Soviet propaganda tried to claim sole credit for defeating Nazi Germany. But the truth survived. Veterans knew, archives revealed, and now, 80 years later, we can tell the full story. We can honor the American contribution to the Eastern Front. We can recognize that American ingenuity, American industry, American determination helped turn the tide of the greatest conflict in human history. The next time someone tells you that the Soviet Union single-handedly defeated Nazi Germany, you'll know the rest of the story. You'll know about the 400,000 American trucks, the 14,000 American aircraft, the 15 million pairs of American boots. You'll know about the merchant mariners who died in Arctic waters, the engineers who worked in Persian heat, the factory workers who built the supplies that kept the Red Army fighting. You'll know about America's hidden contribution to Soviet victory. This is the power of American industrial might. This is the brilliance of American strategic thinking. This is the generosity of American character. When freedom was threatened, when evil spread across continents, when the world needed a defender, America answered the call. Not just with American soldiers fighting American battles, but with American resources supporting allies everywhere, even former adversaries, even ideological opponents, because defeating fascism mattered more than any political difference. Remember this story. Remember these unsung American heroes. Remember that sometimes the greatest acts of courage happen not on battlefields, but in factories and shipyards and ports. Remember that American contributions to World War II victory extended far beyond D-Day and the Pacific War. American power, American generosity, American determination helped save the world. These acts of courage, these acts of strategic brilliance, these acts of unprecedented generosity shaped history. They ensured that democracy survived its greatest test. They proved that America, when committed to a cause, when fighting for freedom, is unstoppable. Subscribe now to witness more untold stories of World War II, more hidden chapters of American heroism, more proof that American courage, American innovation, and American determination have always been the forces that defend freedom and defeat tyranny wherever it threatens our world.